Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. We're here to launch the 19th edition of the Global Carbon Budget, which has been therefore running since 2006. My name is Rachel Kite. I am the UK's Special Representative for Climate, and I'm delighted to be here with lead authors from the University of Exeter, and in an extraordinary collaboration of more than 119 scientists from 86 organisations across 19 countries contributing to this edition of the Global Carbon Budget. Unfortunately, it makes for extraordinarily sobering reading. I'm going to leave Mike and Stephen to talk you through the details, but in short, the emissions from fossil fuels have reached a record high, and the peaking that we have been desperately waiting for and working towards has not yet arrived, which underlines the importance of why we're all here at COP29, and underlines the importance of the work that has to happen here on climate finance and how we help countries through that transition and speed the transitions that are underway. Also underlines the importance of ambition in the next generation of nationally determined contributions. And of course, the UK was proud to be able to have our Prime Minister announce our ambitious NDC yesterday with an 81% cut in emissions by 2035 over 1990 levels. But let's go back to the global carbon budget and perhaps from the sobering science that it contains, take some renewed determination to work together to achieve our goals. So I'm going to pass first to Mike, I think, and then to Stephen. Thank you. Take it away.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, good morning, everyone. So it's a pleasure to be here today to present the Global Carbon Budget 2024. So I'd start off by saying that even though me and Stephen are here, we're just two members of this massive team. So we had 120 people contribute to the report this year from 86 organisations across 19 countries. So this really is a massive team effort, which is only possible due to this international collaboration. So all the data is now available online. So you can go to globalcarbonbudget.org to download all the data from this year's report, or you can go to the Global Carbon Atlas, where you can see certain visualizations and graphics of the data. So that's all available online. So in a nutshell, what the GCB tries to do is quantify the anthropogenic perturbation to the carbon cycle. So this is predominantly that left-hand side arrow, which is fossil fuel emissions, and emissions from deforestation and land use change, which is the yellow arrow to the right. And together, these two emission sources are causing an increase in atmospheric CO2. However, only about half of those emissions remain in the atmosphere, and the remainder are absorbed by the land and the ocean sinks, which we indicate with the green arrow and the blue arrow pointing down into the land and the ocean. So this is kind of a summary of what we do. We also indicate on this figure the carbon uptake from novel CDR, so carbon dioxide removal, which is that tiny purple arrow next to the grey arrow, which Stephen will mention. And this is just really for visualization purposes. So that was the summary of GCB, but the key highlights this year, we'll start off with fossil CO2 emissions. So this is global fossil CO2 emissions from 1960 to present day. And as you can see, we've just had this steady increase over time. We had a rapid increase around the 2000 periods as China's economy picked up. And then in the latter decade or so, we've had a slowdown in that growth rate. And this is really driven by the kind of increase in renewable technology. In terms of emissions peaking, we don't really see that yet, because in 2024, we're estimating an increase in carbon dioxide emissions by 0.8%, and now reaching over 37 gigatons of CO2 in 2024. So it's a new record, it's a new high value, so it's not the good news we were hoping for. So now I'm going to break the fossil CO2 emissions down into the individual components and the individual regions. So starting on the left-hand side, we can see CO2 emissions from coal, oil, and gas are the three lines at the top. And the headline result here is that all three sources had an increase in emissions in 2024. For coal, we can see that around 2010 we had this plateau, and that was as the US and the EU continued to phase out coal, and that kind of balanced increases elsewhere. And we thought coal might have peaked, but as you can see in the last 3, 4, 5 years, that's not the case, and now coal is at a new record high. And that's really driven by increases in China and India, as living standards are rising rapidly in India, so is their coal burning. For oil, we saw a large reduction in 2020. That was the COVID pandemic, where we just had a reduction in any sorts of travel. And we thought maybe that would be our peak of oil, but sadly, oil emissions have continued to rise year on year, and we're now back at pre-pandemic levels, as aviation and shipping have continued to rise each year. For gas emissions, we've had a pretty much steady increase of 2% per year in general. The last few years, we actually had a slowdown due to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and high gas prices actually led to reductions in gas. But in 2024, we're projecting an increase of over 2% again. So one of the highest growth rates we've had recently is gas in 2024. If we now move across to the right-hand side, these are the major emitters of fossil CO2. The main one is China. So China saw a large growth in 2023. And in 2024, we project a small increase, about 0.2%. So I'll caveat this, that say that the error bars are around that zero. So we're not 100% sure whether China has increased or decreased, and especially because 2024 is not over yet. But we think our projection is a slight increase or roughly flat for China. US and EU, we can see this kind of continual decline in emissions as coal's being phased out. It's a lot stronger decrease in Europe than America, but it's still about 1% in the USA, so it's still on the right track. India, as I mentioned before, we're having an increase in living standards, and then electricity demand is just skyrocketing. And although renewables are having a strong rise in India, it just can't keep pace with the demand. So that extra demand is being met with coal, and that's causing this rise in Indian emissions. And then at the bottom, you can see bunker fuels, which is one of the main reasons for the rise in emissions in 2024, which is this increase in aviation and shipping. So overall, we're just seeing a steady increase in emissions, and all fossil fuels have increased in 2024. So it's not exactly the direction we want to be heading in. So that was the one component of the emissions. Now we can go on to the second component, which is the land use change. So the figure on the left, this is the net land use change emissions at a global scale. This flux really is a sum of lots of different processes. So you've got deforestation, reforestation, afforestation, you've got peat drainage, we've got wood harvest and removal. So it's lots and lots of things added together for all the different countries. And the headline is that land use change emissions are still substantial and are contributing drastically to increases in atmospheric CO2. The good news is that we are seeing a robust decline in this emission now. So over the last 10, 15 years, we have had a negative trend, which is good news for net zero. There is a slight uptick in 2024, and we think this is due to a legacy from El Nino. There's kind of climate conditions which are interacting with deforestation rates. We don't read too much into this because we think it's just a blip, and we think hopefully that the trend will continue downwards next year. So moving to the right-hand side, this is kind of looking more into the details of the individual drivers. And the real kind of key part for land use change is changes in forest area. So that's where the real emissions come from. So on the top, that red line is deforestation emissions. So this is a conversion from forest land to non-forest land, and we're seeing a large emission of carbon to the atmosphere there. On the flip side, we're also seeing some areas with increased forest area, and this is the green line on the bottom. So these two are somewhat balancing out. Deforestation is a larger flux. And then other land use transitions and land cover changes on the global net scale are roughly zero. So wood harvest is there, and it's near the zero line. There are a lot of gross fluxes involved with wood harvest, but overall, the net flux is pretty small. So one key thing we also do for land use change emissions is separate out permanent changes and what are kind of temporary changes from shifting cultivation or rotational agriculture. So on the top, on the left, in the red is this deforestation, so that's emissions to the atmosphere. In green, we've got sinks or carbon uptake by the land. In the bold colours, we've got these permanent fluxes, and in the lighter shades, we've got these temporary fluxes. And the reason we separate it out like this is if you look at the bottom, so just look at the reforestation section, you can see that the majority of that flux is by this kind of light colour, which is this temporary shifting cultivation. And that flux is inherently tied to the deforestation one on the top. So if we wanted to, say, reduce the deforestation emissions on the top from shifting cultivation, then we would lose that regrowth on the bottom as well. These two fluxes are just tightly coupled with each other. So from a policy perspective, what we really care about is the kind of the bold, permanent fluxes. And if we just focus on those to start with, so the permanent deforestation, we can see is a substantial flux here. But as I said previously, it is decreasing over time, which is good news. It somewhat might have plateaued in the last couple of years, but the general trend is one of down. And then for the reforestation, afforestation, that flux is now substantial, but it has plateaued. So you can see that kind of solid grey block has flatlined in recent years, which obviously isn't good news for net zero. We want that flux to be as large as possible, and then obviously the deforestation come down to zero. If we now move across to the right-hand side, this is looking at the top 3 emitters this is the net flux now, so this is all those processes added together. And you can see 3 countries are responsible for 60% of global emissions. So you've got these 3 tropical countries, Brazil, Indonesia, and DRC, are responsible for 60% of the global net land use emissions. I would point out that a lot of the deforestation and a lot of the land use change here is driven by commodities in the northern hemisphere. So Europe, US, and China are demanding products from these tropical countries. So there are policy levers we can pull in the global north, which can have a massive impact on emissions in the tropics. So that's me done on the emissions, and now I'll pass over to Stephen to talk about the rest.
Okay, thank you, Mike. So now, it's the wrong way. Okay, so now we'll turn to carbon dioxide removal. To reach the Paris Agreement, we need steep decreases in emissions, and that's complemented by CDR. So that's, for example, to compensate for the residual CO2 emissions. So what is CDR? So carbon dioxide removal is removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere which isn't coming from fossil sources. So it needs to be additional in terms of the natural sinks, and also needs to have a long legacy in terms of storage. So on the left-hand side, this is what Mike has already alluded to. So one of the big levers we do have in terms of preventing dangerous climate change is on this change in forest area and removal side through afforestation and reforestation. So what we see here is this is equivalent to about 5% of annual fossil fuel emissions. So if we think about CDR in terms of the photosynthesis base, that's reforestation, afforestation, BECCS, and biochar, they account for about 99.9% of the total CDR. So what you see then is the rest on the right-hand side. That's the technologically sort of driven CDR. So you can see through direct air CO2 capture, and also enhanced geological weathering. And so, that's really equivalent to 1/1,000,000th of annual fossil fuel emissions. So you see there on the bottom, you have the 0.0 sort of megatons. Contrast that with the gigatons of the forest regrowth term. Okay, so really what the message of this slide is saying is we need to protect the existing forest, the forest sinks, and we need to expand them. So that's our sort of big lever on the land side. But also we need to scale up the technological CDR. Okay, so now we move on to total emissions. So as Mike has already alluded to, we have the black, we have the increase unfortunately, in fossil fuel emissions. And that's counted over sort of the last decade since the 1990s with a decrease in the land use emissions. So when you sum them together, you get the red curve. So there's a mixed message here. So the good news is over the last decade, the total emissions has plateaued. That contrasts with the previous decade, where you see quite a steep 2% rise in total emissions. So this is a mix of good and bad news, but essentially, if we want to go for net zero and avoiding dangerous climate change, we need really to have steep reductions in total emissions. Okay, so moving to the carbon sinks. So the carbon sinks are continuing. That's the good news. So the carbon sinks in the land on the left-hand side and the oceans on the right. That's despite climate change having a negative impact on the sinks. So if we concentrate on the left-hand side, on the land sink, you see in the final year, 2023, an over 40% reduction in the land sink relative to 2022. And this is linked to El Nino conditions at the end of 2023, essentially causing drought to big tropical forests in Amazonia and Southeast Asia. Okay, and then on the right-hand side, you see we're continuing sink in the oceans, and that's been relatively flat from 2016, and we sort of understand why that is, and that's explained by climate variability. Okay, so we've talked about the emissions, we talked about the natural sinks, which take up about 50% on average of those sinks. So what actually happens then into the atmosphere? And you see the headline figure is that the atmosphere has increased by 2.8 parts per million in 2023, and we predict a similar increase in 2024. That's actually higher than the decadal average, and that's, as I say, we've got the high emissions, but also the lower land sinks, so hence you have more CO2 left into the atmosphere. So sort of bleak news, really. So we really need to have large decreases. We need to go towards net zero to really sort of avoid dangerous climate change. Okay, so we also in GCB track progress towards mitigation targets. And so we assess something called the remaining carbon budget. So that's the remaining carbon budget to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees or 1.7 or 2 degrees. So we factor in the current warming, future warming, the non-CO2 climate forces such as methane, nitrous oxide, and aerosols. And we also factor in climate carbon cycle feedback such as sort of permafrost soil degradation. Okay, so the headline figure really is that we calculate that we have 235 billion tons of carbon left before we hit the 1.5 degree target. So as Mike's alluded to, we've got emissions of about 40 billion tons, so 235 divided by 40 is about 6 years. So we've got 6 years until we hit, well, we've got 6 years of current levels of emissions before we hit the 1.5 degree target. And then also for 1.7 degrees and 2 degrees, that's 14 and 27 years respectively. So I'd just like to acknowledge support we've received through Future Earth and the WCRP and other agencies and funding organizations. And it's been, as Mike has said, a lot of work from hundreds of scientists across the globe. So thank you.
If there are any questions, the team's happy to answer them. In the front row and then the second row.
Good morning, and thank you very much for this presentation. Clément Albergel, head of the team at the European Space Agency implementing ESA's climate program. I had a question regarding your point on the weakening of the capacity of the land to store carbon. How can this be projected in the future year? You mentioned the impact of El Nino. Could it be that the land will continue to store carbon at level before El Nino or not?
Okay, so I think we need to, there's a few months left of this year, so we need to wait and see. But essentially what you've seen in 2023 for the natural land sink, you've had the exceptional fires in Canada, at the first half of the year, and then you've had at the end of 2023, you've had the El Nino, which has impacted the land sink, which has gone on to April 2024. So you've got a residual effect of the droughts in places like Amazonia, etc. But on top of that, which I suspect the next question will be, in September, October, we've had these massive fires in Brazil. So colleagues at INPE have told us how every ecosystem in Brazil has had almost record number of degradation fires. So we know that deforestation in Brazil has gone down this year, whereas the degradation fires has gone up. So I think it's a record in every ecosystem. I think it's the second highest in the Cerrado. So I think what will happen is you'll have a recovery in some of the ecosystems, but on the flip side, you've got the degradation fires taking us down. So it's unclear.
Thank you. There's a gentleman here with a microphone. Excuse me? Oh, okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Steve and Mike, for the wonderful piece of work, even though it's a bit disappointing news, the state of emissions we are reaching. Two quick questions. First,
Sorry, for the record, can you introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry. Davila Pola from the University of Campinas in Brazil. First question, where is the afforestation and reforestation mainly taking place in geographical terms? And I didn't understand exactly, you guessed it right. My question is about degradation. I wonder how you are considering it and how it's affecting the estimates. Thank you.
Okay, I'll take the second question first with regards to the degradation. So in GCB, we have the fire emissions through GFED, which is putting deforestation together with degradation. So I think there is a question of, how you pull that apart, how much is the natural, how much is the land use signal. But I think we are capturing essentially the net there. So what I find interesting that we are capturing for Brazil, for example, the effect of degradation on the natural sinks, but also things like fragmentation impacts. So whether that's land use or natural is debatable. But I think the net we're capturing. The afforestation, yourself, there's various secondary forests in Brazil and other tropical countries. You've got the sort of wood harvest, etc., in the temperate regions. You've got the expansion of plantations in China as well, so vast expansion of plantations.
Any other questions? Well, thank you very much to the members of the press. Thank you very much for communicating science in the way that you do. And to the scientists, thank you for keeping us honest and for helping us look around the corners of what's coming. Have a good COP. Thank you.